evening. I'm Kaylee Thomas. I am the assistant librarian here at the Gilford Public Library. You've probably seen me here all the time. We are very excited to have Caroline Hughes, the Loon Preservation Committee staff biologist and volunteer outreach coordinator here tonight to talk to you all about loons. But I just want to mention some upcoming programs really quick. Next week we have the Weir's A Stroll Through Time on Tuesday. And then we have some Halloween programs coming up after that as well. So you can check them out with our calendar upstairs. And if anyone has any questions, just stop by and see me after, I guess. And we are being recorded tonight, so if you don't want to be on video, just don't turn around. Or walk out that way. All right, thank you. Thank you, Caroline.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to the library for having me. Thank you all for coming. I'm excited to be here. So yeah, my name's Caroline. I'm a biologist at the Loon Preservation Committee. I've been working there since 2016. And so just a little bit of background about LPC before I dive into all the loon stuff. We're a nonprofit organization that was formed in 1975 in response to a really noticeable decline in New Hampshire's state loon population. And since then, we've been working with a group of volunteers to help bring our population back. And so I want to start this discussion of loons with a discussion of their calls, because for a lot of people, that's the thing that really draws them to loons. They have this really prolific, really distinctive call, and it's just sort of a symbol of the wilderness. It's become really, well known to the point where it's used in television and movies to denote that they're in the wilderness, even if they're not in an area that loons live. So I've heard a loon call in Breaking Bad, and obviously the loons are not in the Southwest, but I think it just really speaks to sort of the appeal of that call, that broad public appeal. What people might not know is that loons have a bunch of different calls that mean different things. So does anyone in here have an idea of how many distinct calls adult loons make? So the minimum, the basic calls, there are 4 of them, and then of course there are different variations of each of those calls. But I have a caller here, so I'm gonna describe what each call means and then I'll play it for you. And I'll start with the wail. The wail is a call that loons use for long distance communication. And they use that, to locate their mate if they become separated on a pond, but they'll also use it to communicate with loons on nearby lakes, or on, if they're on a big lake like Winnipesaukee where there are a bunch of different loon territories, they'll use it to communicate with loons on nearby territories. You might hear it especially at night, where they do what we call the night chorus, which is sort of a late night roll call where, each territory will call back and forth to each other to check in and say, yeah, I'm here, don't come here, to each other. So here's that wail call. So that's a pretty distinct one. Most people have heard that one. The next one I'm going to play is a little less common. Unless you've been in really close proximity to loons, you probably haven't heard it, because this is the call that they use for really short range communication. It's much softer. And so this is really a call that's primarily used between the family unit, so between a mated pair and their chicks. And like I said, it's called the hoot. Much softer, much shorter, just a cute little call. Has anyone in here heard that one in the wild before? Yeah, so you have to, be lucky enough to be pretty close to the loons in order to hear that one. The third one is called the tremolo, and this is probably another one that you're very familiar with. It's a call that loons make when they're feeling stressed or threatened. So we'll often hear them making this call if an intruding loon is coming into their territory and challenging them, or if they perceive some sort of threat. So if there's a person in a boat getting too close to them or their nest or their chicks, or if they see an eagle fly overhead. We'll occasionally also hear it if they see a plane fly overhead. We think that they're mistaking those planes for eagles, a predator that threatens them. So here's that tremolo. So you've probably heard that one before.
Yeah.
And the last call is unique in that only the male loons make it. And so it's similar in its purpose to the tremolo. It denotes, stress. It denotes that the loon's feeling threatened. But it also denotes that this loon is ready to fight whatever it's perceiving as a threat. So it's a really aggressive call. So again, we'll see this call when an intruder is coming in, the male will do it, and usually when they yodel, they assume this posture where they put they extend their neck down low over the water, and let it out. And we think probably that's because getting so close to the water sort of amplifies it. Another really interesting fact about the yodel is that each male loon's yodel is unique, so they can sort of recognize each other. And that can be beneficial because if a male loon has been in a fight with another male loon before and lost that fight, if he hears that same yodel, he'll know, all right, I don't want to bother that guy. I'm going to keep on moving. And so here's the yodel. Has anyone heard that one before? Sort of sounds like an angry seagull call. Another really interesting fact about that yodel is that preliminary research suggests that young loons, so the offspring, can recognize their father's call. And we think, based on, again, very limited data, but we think that that's an adaptation to make sure that they're not competing directly with their parents, that they're not going to potentially get into a fatal fight with their parents. So those are the 4 basic loon calls, and of course there are a lot of different variations on those calls that sound slightly different. For instance, when loons are flying overhead, they'll often do a modified tremolo, and we think that is to try to solicit a response from lakes that they're flying over so that they can see, okay, is this one occupied, is it safe to land, or should I try to find somewhere else? And of course there are different calls that the chicks make that aren't represented here. We call it sort of a mewling. But they typically grow out of making that call by the time they're adults. Okay, so now that we've talked about what loons look like, what they sound like, I'd like to talk a little bit about what they look like. So most of you are probably familiar with adult loons and their breeding plumage. They have that really striking black and white plumage, the white speckles across the back, the white striped necklace, the bright red eye, and that really, really sharp dagger-like bill. What you might not realize is that loons don't look like that throughout the entire year. So around this time, they start to molt their feathers and they molt into their winter plumage. So you'll probably, as you're going around the lakes, September through November, see loons looking like this, where their feathers are starting to change. And usually it does start up around their bill and it, eventually makes its way down their whole body. And so by the time that they're on their wintering grounds, loons look almost completely unrecognizable from how they looked in the summer. So they're much more drab, a brownish gray. Their eye still remains red, but dulls down to more of a reddish brown. Their bill dulls down to a gray or even a white on some loons. And they just, if you didn't know that they did this, you might not realize that a bird that you're seeing when you're on the ocean coast during the winter is a loon. You'll also notice that their diet does change a bit. We frequently have people sending us pictures of wintering loons on the coast that are eating lobster and crab. So they eat pretty well when they're on the ocean. And another thing that people tend to be surprised by is the fact that they can have this double life where they're going from freshwater to saltwater and back within the course of a year. And they do have certain adaptations to help them cope with that. So they have a supraorbital gland, a gland above their eye, that helps them filter out the salt from the food that they're eating and the water that they're drinking on the ocean, and they secrete it through their nostrils. So that's just one of a few different adaptations that they have that allows them to transition from fresh to salt water. So loons are on the ocean from the time that they leave our lakes in mid-fall, November-ish, until ice goes out on our lakes. And they have this really uncanny ability to show up on the lakes pretty much the day of or the day after ice out. And we think that, because our loons here in New Hampshire are really just spending their winters off the New Hampshire coast in the Gulf of Maine area, that they're able to make recon trips to check on their lakes, see if the ice is out. If it's not, they either go back to the ocean or stop over on a nearby lake that has had ice out already. And then, keep checking back and forth until finally they're able to land on their lake again. And so once they get back to our lakes, the members of the pair will spend a couple weeks getting reacquainted with each other. They don't spend the winter together, as far as we're aware, The males and females winter separately. And so when they come back to the lakes, if it's a pair that's been together before, they'll spend a couple weeks reestablishing their pair bond. If it's a pair that hasn't been together before, they spend those weeks, forming that initial pair bond. And so during that time, which is usually from mid-April to early to mid-May, you'll see the loons sort of just out drifting around together. They might be checking out nest sites. They might, be fishing together. But really, if you see two loons on your lake at the beginning of the season moving around in sync, they're probably a pair. And then by late May, early June, they've started nesting. So for us in New Hampshire, most loons have started nesting by the first week of June. They lay usually 2 eggs. Sometimes it's only 1, and on very rare occasions they'll lay 3. But more often than not, it's 2, and they lay those eggs 12 to 24 hours apart. And so because 1 egg has that head start on being incubated, typically it will hatch a day, 12 to 24 hours ahead of its sibling. So loons incubate their eggs for 28 days, and I do have a little replica egg that we had used in an experiment that we did last year. So I'll pass this around just so you can get an idea of the size, because they're pretty big, and it's a lot of energy for that female loon to expend to produce 2 of these. And some loons, if their first nest fails, will actually re-nest. And so the record I think that we have in New Hampshire is 1 female laying 5 eggs within a summer. And again, it's a big egg, it's a lot of energy, so it's pretty impressive that they can do that. And so because 1 chick typically hatches a little bit before its sibling, it has a day's worth of parental care on its sibling. It's been fed, and because of that, it tends to be a little stronger, and so they do, assert dominance over their younger sibling. It can seem sort of cruel from a human point of view, but in some cases, if resources are really limited, if there's not enough food for a pair of loons to support both chicks, the older chick will sometimes either cause its sibling to be excluded from the family, and then it, because it's not being fed, it will die, or they'll directly commit siblicide by pecking their sibling. And again, it's hard to watch, it's hard to think about, but that's a strategy that they've adapted to ensure that in times of scarce resources, at least 1 chick is going to survive. So by the time those chicks hatch, they're pretty much good to go from the start of their life. They can, after just a couple hours drying out on the nest, get in the water and swim. They can dive, although for at least the first couple days, they're sort of like a little cork where they take very short, shallow dives, but can't really stay underwater very well. And during that first 1 to 2 weeks is when they're the most vulnerable to predators and to, temperature fluctuations that their tiny little bodies can't handle. And so for those first couple weeks of life, they spend a lot of time back riding on their parents. That's to help them stay warm, but also to protect them from things like largemouth bass and snapping turtles that can easily come up from underneath and grab a loon chick for a snack. By the time loon chicks are about 5 to 6 weeks old, they start molting out of that down that they have when they're first hatched, and developing their first set of juvenile plumage. So this is a loon that's partway through that process. We tend to refer to this as the punk rock phase because as they're losing their down, they start to look really scruffy. They can look like they have little mohawks. They just look pretty funny. And this is a loon chick. If you ever see one doing this, it's begging its parent for food. I've witnessed in real life and seen videos from some of our volunteers of them getting pretty aggressive. They'll bite at their parent. They'll just be totally annoying until finally the parent gives in and catches them a fish. And so the loon chicks, at this point, they can catch some of their own food, but they still are relying pretty heavily on their parents. And then by the time they're about 12 weeks old, they look entirely different. They're totally out of that down. Their bodies have elongated, their feet and legs have elongated, their bill has elongated. And a juvenile in its plumage, once it's pretty much full grown, looks very similar to an adult in its winter plumage. And so around this time of year and into November, if the loons are still on the lakes, it can be sort of difficult to distinguish between the adults and their chicks. At this point, they are totally self-sufficient in terms of getting their own food, but they will still beg from their parents and get a free meal if they can. So our adult loons leave the lakes around October, mid-October to mid-November. The chicks stay later. In recent years, we've seen the chicks staying as late as mid-December and even mid-January, depending on when ice comes in. Most of those mid-January loon chicks are ones that we have to go and rescue because once the ice comes in, it's harder for loons to take off. That's because they need a really long runway to get off because they have relatively short wings and they have dense bones, so they're really heavy. So they need a lot of takeoff space, and if the ice starts coming in and they don't have that much space, they can get trapped.
Was that an adult and the baby?
No, so this is two siblings.
It's two siblings.
Yeah, but the
One-
adults do look pretty similar.
Yeah, and one looks so much bigger than the other one.
Yeah, and so that's
It
again a
does.
function of that,
Yeah.
one being born earlier, and all summer long it ensures it gets more food than its sibling.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they do tend to be pretty significantly different in weight, by the end of the season. Okay, so when loons are on our lakes in the spring and summer, there are a lot of different things that are threats to them. And I've chosen this photo to represent this for a couple of reasons. One that I'll get into immediately and another that's gonna come up a little bit later. But loons are totally adapted to be amazing fishermen. So they have feet that are placed really far back on their bodies, and that helps them really maximize the propulsive force that they get when they kick, so that just a small kick can shoot them forward in the water. They also have dense bones, unlike most other birds, to help weigh them down and help them be able to navigate really well underwater. And they have a specialized vertebrae in their necks that allows them to swivel their head really efficiently. And so all those things combine to make a loon essentially a fish-seeking torpedo in the water. But those same adaptations that make a loon so well adapted to life in the water make them really bad on land. So has anyone in here ever seen a loon trying to get up onto its nest? It's pretty awkward to watch. They sort of, because their legs are so far back, they can't stand upright. And so they have to flop themselves down on their chests and scoot themselves along with their feet. And as you can imagine, that's a really inefficient way to move around. It takes a lot of energy, and it's really slow. And because of that, when they're on land, they're really vulnerable to predators. If something comes up on them and they're on land far away from the water, they can't get away easily and are a pretty easy meal for that predator. And so loons typically will not go on land unless they're either nesting or in some sort of distress. And when they nest really close to the water's edge so that if a predator does come up by them, they can easily get back into the water, back into their element where they can escape. So we often see loons nesting in sites like this, or like this, or like this. And back when humans weren't building on lakes and damming lakes, that was okay. That was a good strategy for them. However, since we've started to adapt the environment, and primarily on dammed lakes where a couple days of heavy rain can cause water levels to either rise a huge amount, or when there's a drawdown because something needs to be fixed with the dam, or for some other reason, that can really affect loon nesting success. Typically on a natural lake with no dam, if there's a few days of heavy rain, the loons can easily build up their nest to keep pace with the water level rise. But on dammed lakes, that's a lot harder, and it can result in flooded nests, which cause the eggs to fail. And likewise, if the water is drawn down too much, it can become too energetically expensive for the loons to keep trying to get back up and down to their nest, and so they'll eventually abandon their eggs. But that's not the only threat that nesting loons face. Shoreline development has been a really big problem. The places that loons like to nest typically are the places that we like to have our docks, or our beaches, or our houses, back when you could build that close to the water's edge. And so the reduction in the amount of available high-quality nesting habitat has negatively impacted loon reproductive success. Human commensal mammals, so those animals that have been around our lakes forever, but now are there in much higher densities because they have human sources of food, so things like raccoons, also happen to be opportunistic predators on loon eggs, and so if the loon's off the nest for even a couple minutes, there's a chance that those mammals can go and predate the eggs and cause the nest to fail. Avian predators, this is something that we've seen an increase in recently as our bald eagle population continues to rebound, which is a really cool and awesome thing for conservation, but in the presence of all these other threats to loons, it does just add one more stress to them. And then things like corvids, so ravens, will also predate loon eggs as well. Curious or unknowing humans. So people getting too close to a loon nest can cause that loon to feel threatened, and when they feel threatened, their primary goal is to get away and be safe, and so they'll get off the nest, which can leave it open and vulnerable to predation, or if it's a really hot day, the eggs might overheat and become inviable, or if it's a really, really cold day, same thing, they might reach fatally cold temperatures. So people getting too close to the nest, either because they're curious and they want a better look, or because they just don't realize the nest is there, can cause nest failure. Contaminants, this is a new and active area of research for us at LPC. So you've probably heard of DDT back in the 1970s causing a lot of nest failure in birds because it caused eggshell thinning. Our Swan Lakes project biologist has been looking into the factors affecting reproductive success on Swan Lake, and as part of that, she's testing eggs that we collect that have failed. And what she's finding is that there are a lot of different contaminants present in those eggs. So things like PFAS, and some do have DDT, chloridane, dioxins, just a whole suite of chemicals. And on some lakes, in concentrations within the egg that has been known to cause reproductive failure in other similar bird species. So we don't quite understand, what levels are important for loons just yet, but the fact that these contaminants are showing up at high levels is a cause for concern, and potentially is something that is negatively affecting their reproductive success. And another threat, and probably the biggest threat to loons in New Hampshire and likely in other states as well, is lead fishing tackle. So if you're out fishing and a fish breaks your line, that fish gets away with the line, any hooks you were using, and any tackle that you were using as well. And that fish is probably going to be swimming a little more slowly or a little more erratically than the other fish in the area, and that makes it a prime target for a loon. Loons swallow their fish whole, and then they have really, really strong stomach acids to help them digest the fish and all the bones, and they also have a muscular portion of their digestive system called a gizzard, where they swallow stones and pebbles to help them break down those fish. And so as all of those things are working to break down the fish, they're also breaking down that lead, and lead is leaching into their system. And a loon that swallows even one tiny little sinker or jig can and usually does, without early intervention, die within 2 to 4 weeks. At LPC, we collect every dead loon that is reported to us, and we have it necropsied so we can find the cause of death. And what we found is that lead fishing tackle is responsible for the overwhelming majority of adult loon deaths in our state. So it's accounted for 44% of documented adult loon deaths since we started really seriously, performing these necropsies and trying to collect adult loons, which is 1989. So it's taking out a huge chunk of our adult population, and that's a really big problem for loons for a couple of reasons. Loons are what we call a K-selected species. So they're very long-lived, and they have a very low annual reproductive output. So usually, on average in New Hampshire, a pair of loons will successfully fledge one chick every other year. So, year to year, these loons aren't producing very many chicks, but they're making up for that by the fact that they live so long. So over the course of their 30-ish year lifespan, they can produce up to 12 to 15 chicks. But if an adult loon's life is cut short because of some unnatural cause like lead poisoning, that can lead to a really serious, negative population level effect. And so from looking at our mortality data and our population data, we've found that lead fishing tackle and deaths relating to that has caused our population growth to slow significantly. it's not growing as fast as it could be if we didn't lose these loons to lead poisoning. These are 2 loons that died of lead poisoning this year, and these are 2 of a confirmed 6 and a suspected 9 loons that have died from lead poisoning this year. So this one on the left was on Lake Massapequa. We collected her early on in the season, back in May, and the one on the right was from Winnipesaukee, collected again in late May. And so, yeah, this is just again to illustrate, losing those loons, we not only lose the adult itself, but we lose all potential future chicks that adult could have had. So now that we have discussed all of those really negative threats, I'd like to finish up by talking about what we're doing to address those threats. And so just a little recap from earlier, LPC was formed in 1975 in response to these really dramatic declines in our loon population. At that point, there were fewer than 100 pairs of loons remaining in the state. And sort of the founding principle was that if human actions had caused those declines, which it seemed very likely that they had, human actions, if they were targeted and thoughtful, could also reverse those declines. And so we have sort of a 4-pronged approach to helping bring our loon population back. So outreach and education, management, research, and monitoring. And outreach and education includes, presentations like the one I'm giving now. We give over 100 of these throughout the state every year, and we're looking to do more. So if you are aware of any other organizations or places that might appreciate a loon presentation, please let me know. But our outreach also includes things like our live loon camp. So for the past 6 years, I believe now, we've been live streaming a nesting pair of loons, and in recent years, it's actually been 2 nesting pairs back to back in the summer. And so people get to watch this, and they get to see every single aspect of this nesting process, from the nest building to the loons laying their eggs. They get to watch all 28 days as they incubate, and they get to see the hatch. And along the way, we also get to see some pretty cool things, like this heron coming along and landing on top of the loon raft. A lot of the times, people will ask me if herons are predators of loon eggs or loon chicks. And based on the way that this loon acted when the heron, landed, I'd have to say probably not. Because, if an eagle comes by, the loons react, and they yell, they scream, they get out of dodge. But this loon did not react to this heron at all. So I have to say, probably did not consider it a threat. We also get to see things like really, really up-close, in-depth views of the chicks hatching. And this is a really cool photo because the chick on the left has obviously just hatched. And if you look really hard, you can see on the egg on the right a pip, which is where the chick first starts to break through with its egg tooth. So it's just a really cool thing to be able to get such an in-depth, up-close, and personal view of these loons and their nesting. This year, unfortunately, we caught a less fortunate event. So this is an eagle that came down actually twice at this loon nest. And so this was the first time it came, and this was a couple days before the egg was expected to hatch. This nest only had 1 egg. And so we saw this eagle come, and the adult loon, jumped off of the nest, and we thought this was it. And this eagle actually landed, flew away, came back, puts its talon on the egg, moves it around a little bit, and flew away. And we thought, what the heck? Why would it do that? Why would it pass up such an easy meal? Well, 3 days later, 4 hours after the chick hatched, the eagle came back and once again flushed the adult and got the chick, unfortunately. And so it was just, horrifying on the one hand because, we and everyone that had been watching the webcam and anticipating this chick so much saw a less than ideal end. But on the other hand, we got a real first-hand look into the dynamics at play and, this age-old battle between loons and eagles. As a side note to this, recently in Maine, it's not totally confirmed yet because they haven't done a necropsy on the eagle, but they found an eagle dead with a puncture wound through it next to a loon nest where there was a dead chick on the nest. So they think what happened was the eagle came in, tried to get the chick, did get the chick, but in the process was fatally stabbed by the adult loon. And we've seen pictures, sent in to us from our volunteers throughout the state showing eagles swooping down at, loons that are in the water with their chick, and the loon stabbing upward at them. And so, they go to great lengths to defend their chicks from this sort of threat. In addition to that education and outreach, we do a lot of management. The nest rafts are potentially what we're the best known for. I don't know if anyone in here has seen one of these rafts. We have several out on Winnipesaukee, and we float about 100 throughout the state every year. And these rafts are really designed to combat a lot of the threats that I talked about earlier. So, they rise and they fall with the water level, so we tend to put them out a lot on lakes that are dammed and have high levels of fluctuation, like the Connecticut lakes up in Pittsburgh. And then they also, they have this guard over the top that's supposed to be an avian predator guard to give the loons a little bit of a physical barrier between them and eagles or any other avian predator that might come down and try to take the eggs. We anchor them about 15 to 20 feet offshore, and so that doesn't necessarily ensure that a mammal isn't going to swim out and predate the eggs, but it makes it a little less likely because it's a little harder for that mammal. And yeah, so we float the rafts. We also float nest signs. So this is our Sunapee region biologist from last year, Sarah, floating signs at a nest site on Lake Sunapee. And the signs are really just, intended to let people know that there's a nest there and that they should stay away from it. In areas where there's, it's high traffic or where there's a documented history of people getting too close and causing the nest to fail, we might also put out these rope lines, which again just provide an additional physical barrier to let people know where they shouldn't go past. Here's a picture of our Winnipesaukee biologist from this year floating some rope line out in the middle of a rainstorm. So in addition to that, we're also really trying to deal with this lead tackle issue. And lead fishing tackle within the size range that's been known to kill loons, which is sinkers and jigs weighing 1 ounce or less, was effectively banned in New Hampshire in 2013. The law went into effect in 2016. But in spite of that, we've still seen a huge number of loon deaths from lead poisoning every year. So last year we had, I believe it was 8. This year we're up to at least 6 and more likely 8 or 9. And so, just because you can't buy lead anymore doesn't mean that people don't still have it in their tackle boxes from, previous purchases. And so we're really trying to get people to voluntarily give that tackle back. And so the idea was to buy it back from them. And so this year we had 9 participating shops where people could go and they could exchange 1 ounce or more of that illegally sized fishing tackle, and in return they would get a $10 voucher that was good, for that store or any other participating tackle shop that they could use to buy lead-free loon-safe tackle or other fishing supplies. We did a pilot version of that program last year where we collected over 4,800 individual pieces of tackle, which weighed a cumulative total of about 29 pounds. And so, with that success, we thought we might as well try to branch out, cover more area, get more participating shops. And the buyback program just ended at the end of September, so we're, pretty soon we're going to be inventorying all of that and, seeing if we succeeded in our goal of really amplifying the amount of tackle that we collected and, permanently removed from circulation. These were the retailers that participated this year, and we're hoping to continue and, expand it even more next year, so keep an eye out for that. Our management also includes Loon Rescues, and so this is a slightly less typical rescue. This is one of those ice rescues that I had mentioned earlier. So this was last year on Spofford Lake in the Monadnock region, where a juvenile loon had gotten iced in, was stuck in this very small patch of open water that was really just about a 15-foot diameter circle. So this is our senior biologist, John Cooley, going out to try and catch that loon. He did eventually catch it, but not before falling through the ice himself. Luckily, he had on his insulated suit, and he was attached to a line that was being held by the fire department in the area. So he was all right. And he caught the loon, took it to the vet. The loon was given a clean bill of health, and so he took it and released it directly onto the ocean to give it a little bit of a head start. More typically, though, our rescues look like this. So this was a photo taken in 2017 of our Monadnock region biologist, Emily Gross. This is a loon that had become tangled in fishing line, and this was while the loon was, actively incubating the nest with its partner. So Emily was actually able to go out and capture it off the nest, untangle it, take it to the vet to make sure it was okay, and then release it back onto the lake that same night. And this loon actually hatched 2 chicks about 2 weeks later. So, in addition to saving the life of the loon, she also saved those 2 chicks. Fishing line entanglement, and I do have some magnets over there that just give a little information on, if you see a loon in distress, including loons that are tangled, call this number. Fishing line entanglement is really debilitating for a loon because usually, even if the line is only on its wing or on its leg, they use their bill to try to get it off. And when that happens, more often than not, their bill ends up totally tangled and wired shut. And that means that not only can they not eat, but they also can't preen and keep themselves waterproof. And so a loon can go from, totally healthy to totally emaciated and waterlogged within as little as a week. So we do try to get out there and rescue every tangled loon we can. Actually, after this talk tonight, I'm going down to Manning Lake in Gilmanton, where one of the 2 chicks that hatched this year is tangled. So we're hoping that we'll be able to catch it tonight. And so if you ever do see a loon that's tangled, please give us a call, because we do want to try to get out there and rescue as many of them as we can. And then research. So there are a lot of different projects that we're doing. I won't go into depth on any of them unless you have specific questions, but banding and tracking loons, this helps us learn really basic facts about loons that we still don't know. For instance, we don't really know the upper limit of a loon's lifespan. The oldest loon of known age in New Hampshire is at least 32 years old. And we think probably that's around the upper limit, but we really don't know because we've only been banding loons for about 30 years. And banding also helps us, figure out where they go in the winter, which is something that, migration is something that not a lot of information is known about for loons. We know that they go off of our coasts, but we don't really know how far. And so, having banded loons that people can recite on the ocean helps us figure that out. Causes of loon mortality, which again just helps us anticipate threats that are, that might need to be addressed, like lead tackle. The effects of climate change on loon reproduction. Loons are a northern species. They're, cold adapted, and so if we're warming up here, how is that going to affect their reproductive output? Effects of contaminants on loon reproduction. Cyanotoxins. This is something that is sort of an ongoing collaboration between LPC and Jim Haney. And so the photo on the right over there is from last year. It was our veterinary intern that was working with us. And she was working with the Haney lab at UNH to try to figure out how these cyanotoxins are moving up through the food chain. So whenever we would band a loon, we get a blood sample, and Jim can take that and see what the levels of these cyanotoxins are in the loon. Kim would go back and catch a fish, and she'd also get a plankton sample to see what those levels were and if they were biomagnifying, things like that. Eggshell thickness. Again, the contaminants and the recovery from DDT from, when it was banned in the 1970s, looking to see if loons have rebounded or if these new contaminants are affecting the thickness of their eggs. And then, of course, the effects of lead on loon survival and population growth rates. And causes of nest failure, again, so that we can try to anticipate future threats and work solutions to those threats into our management strategies. And I saved this for last, but it's certainly not least. Monitoring is a really, really important part of what we do. It's what first clued us in to the fact that loons were in trouble in New Hampshire, and it's how we measure the success of our management strategies. And so every summer we employ 6 seasonal biologists, plus we have myself, my supervisor, and a Squam Lake biologist who's year-round. And we send them out to count loons. So they go out, they survey over 350 lakes combined, and what they're looking for is there a loon pair on this lake? If yes, did that loon pair nest? If they nested, we collect a lot of additional detail, like where was that nest, how covered and obscured was it from people and also from sunlight, If the nest failed, why did it fail? How many eggs were there? You know, how many of those eggs hatched? How many of the chicks that hatched survived to the end of the season? In addition to other things, but those are sort of the main things. And from that, here's our, this is how we divide up the state. So each biologist ends up covering somewhere between 70 and 100 lakes. So it's a big task. It's a big thing that we ask of them. And because it is such a big task, we also have a volunteer network of over 1,000 people that are helping us keep track as well. What we found from this monitoring is that since LPC started in 1975, our loon population has more than tripled. So we went from having fewer than 100 pairs in our state. And this graph is it might be a little confusing because this is showing the number of paired adults. So multiply the number of pairs by 2 to get what's on this graph. So, you know, when we started, we had somewhere around 130 loons. This past year, we had around 315 pairs. So, you know, 630 adult loons, plus a population of unpaired loons, around 100 of those as well. So our population has more than tripled, and we like to think that our, you know, our management and our outreach has at least played some role in that. That being said, there's still a lot of work to do. You know, there's still a lot of threats that that we haven't, you know, totally eliminated yet, lead being one. And we think that our loon population is currently at about half of what New Hampshire's carrying capacity is. So there are a lot of lakes out there that have really great loon habitat that still don't have loons. And those lakes have been, you know, slowly filling in over time, and we hope that that'll continue. And with that, does anyone have questions? Yes.
Do loons mate for life?
That is, yeah, that's something that people used to think before we started banding, because it's pretty much impossible to tell individual loons apart. You usually can't even tell the male and female apart when they're on the lake together. And so the answer is sort of. So loons have really high territory fidelity, so chances are on a given lake that that same pair is coming back year after year. But loons are much more loyal to their territory than they are to their mate. So if an intruding loon comes in and challenges a member of the pair, and the member of the pair loses, gets booted out. And that intruder becomes the new mate to the remaining loon there. So they do switch mates, or you know, if one loon dies over the winter and doesn't come back, its territory will probably be filled in by another loon. So generally, unless they lose a fight or die over the winter, it is, you know, the same pair, and they typically will, if not for life, at least mate together for several years, but not always.
And will their chicks come back to that same lake?
So chicks, from what we know, and the data that we have is really from Wisconsin, where the lakes are much more dense. And so in Wisconsin, loon chicks typically will colonize a lake that's within 13 kilometers of the lake that they were hatched on. Here in New Hampshire, where our loons, you know, our lakes are a little more few and far between than they are in Wisconsin, they probably go a little further. And so, you know, they might come back to the same lake that they were hatched on, but they might also go to a nearby lake. But usually they're within the same general geographic area. Although we do have some loons, and in New Hampshire we haven't done as much banding of the chicks, so we don't really know which one is, you know, when a chick comes back we don't know where it came from. But from the few loons that we have banded, we know that the females seem to be dispersing a lot further than the males. We have some female chicks that have gone as far as 80 miles from their natal lake. So definitely possible that our loons here in New Hampshire are behaving a lot differently than the ones over in Wisconsin. Yes?
It would seem that 100 years of fishing with lead sinkers has covered the bottoms of our lakes with lead. Mm-hmm. And that your efforts to deal with the lead that's in Grandpa's box is, you know, a tiny amount. And so I'm wondering, have you seen any evidence that your efforts in that regard have actually started to reduce the number of loons who are ingesting lead from the bottom of their lakes?
So when we do the necropsies, what we've found is that the lead tackle that we're collecting, there are a couple different lines of evidence that suggest that loons are more often than not getting it from active use. So often they have, they still have the skirts or the line with it, and our rate of loon deaths pretty much perfectly mirrors human use of our lakes, whereas, if they were getting it primarily from the bottom, we would expect a constant rate of loon deaths from lead poisoning, from as soon as they got back on our lakes to as soon as they left, April through November. And what we see is that it's really low April, May, June, and then it really sharply peaks in July, August, and then sort of levels out again. And so based on that, it would seem that they're getting it from tackle that is actively used. Often, like I said, there's still the skirt on the jig or, what have you. That to us seems to suggest that they're getting it from active use. We do have some volunteers who have taken it upon themselves to go and, use metal detectors and try to collect as much lead tackle from the bottom as they can. But we do think that they're getting it more from active use than scooping it off the bottom. Although I'm sure that does, happen at least occasionally.
So when you come across a loon nest habitat, you're really only looking at 2 adults and 2 chicks, and at the end of that season, the chicks are probably going to have relocated, and you're going to have another pair and more chicks. So you're never going to find a cluster of more than a few loons in one place?
So it depends on the size of the lake. Some lakes, and really the geography of the lake as well. If you have a slightly larger lake, it might be able to accommodate 2 to 3 pairs. Winnipesaukee has 30 pairs. But they're really territorial. They stake out these defined territories. And so within a given summer, you're really seeing the same 2 loons. If they have chicks, it's those same chicks. And so once they leave in the fall, the chicks stay on the ocean for about 3 years before they come back. They don't sexually mature until they're 3 years old. So if you see a loon in that breeding plumage, it's at least 3 years old. But typically it's the same adults coming back to that same area. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. So the chicks stay year round at the ocean until they're 3.
Until they're 3. Typically, we do. In a given year, we'll usually see 4 to 5 immature loons that have come back, and usually those loons end up getting their butt kicked by the adult whose territory they have the misfortune of landing on. And so, it seems like they're staying over there until they're big enough and strong enough to, really hold their own and find their own territory.
We really identify with loons in New Hampshire, and now you're mentioning Wisconsin. Are there other states that are loon heavy that we wouldn't think about?
So Wisconsin has probably the densest loon population in the U.S. Their state bird is the loon. Maine has really, really high loon population, a couple thousand over there. We have 600-700 here. Vermont has a couple hundred. New York, especially the Adirondacks, has loons. But really, a lot of that sort of northern tier of states where bordering Canada have loons. Wisconsin has a bunch. Washington has some. Even down in the Yellowstone National Park has a couple loons on the lakes within the park. So a lot of the northern of the lower 48 states have loons, and of course Alaska has a ton. And here in New Hampshire and in the lower 48, we only really have the common loon, but there are actually 5 species of loon that exist in the world, and all 5 breed in Alaska. Yes?
When the adult loons migrate from the lakes to the ocean, are they apt to migrate to the same territory at the ocean, and do they return when they come back to the lakes to the same lake?
They do tend to come back to the same lake, especially if they've been successful at reproducing there in the past. With regards to whether they go to the same spot in the ocean, that's something that we're really not as sure of. There haven't been a lot of studies done on the wintering behavior of loons, although that's changing now. People are starting to do those studies. We did have an LPC volunteer over the past several years that would go to one spot in Maine on the coast. It's called Biddeford Pool, and she would photograph the loons there. And she happened to catch photos of a banded loon several years in a row, which does seem to suggest that they're going back to the same wintering sites as well, that they have that sort of site fidelity. But that's really a sample size of one loon. So we'll know more hopefully in the coming years as the, the research that's being done now is published. Any other questions? I do have non-lead tackle up there that's available. Please do take some if you fish or know someone who does. And I've got a lot of informational brochures and pamphlets as well. Thank you very much.